Hello everyone and welcome back to the second lecture on the paper Introduction to Literary Theory. So in the first video we have already seen what led to the emergence of literary theory, the meaning, the definition and also the origin of the word theory, and finally we have also seen the significance of the year 1963. We have also seen how theory was the privileged domain of the few in the 1980s and how it comes to the ordinary scholars in all the universities in the year 1990s and thereafter. So in the following video we'll continue to see a little introduction to literary theory, and we'll then take on Plato and discuss some of his ideas which are important for us. So I would discuss another important idea of interpretation. Now, how would you define interpretation? It's nothing but encounter between a reader and a text. And in simple language, we would also refer to it as reading. So there is a text and there is a reader, and when both of them come in contact, we have something called reading, or in other words, it could also be called as interpretation. So what are the kind of activities that happen when the text comes in contact with the reader or vice versa? So you could have personal response. The reader could give his personal response to the text. Maybe he would like the text, maybe he would not like the text, and different kinds of experiences of the reader could be seen. The reader may also appreciate the text, and that's one of the other reactions that we see. Explication, that is the reader would impose his meanings onto the text. The text in itself would not have any meaning, but the reader can definitely impose his meanings onto the text. Exegesis is where the text speaks to the reader. The text also has the ability to influence the reader to think in a particular pattern, and that also is a possibility while the encounter between the text and the reader. Then the reader may evaluate the text considering its merits, demerits and others, and there's a historical phenomenon, and then also the reader can critique the text. All these are the possible activities that can happen when there is an encounter between the reader and the text. So let me give you one example, and this is a school that we'll be also looking at in a little while later in this particular paper. There was a school that came across who called themselves as new critics, and what was the kind of thought that they promoted? They said text is autonomous, so it is devoid of all things that we see actually around the world. For example, it's very important for us to know the historical background in which a particular text was produced. The other important thing that we would be actually looking at while evaluating a text is the life of an author or the biography of an author. But the new critics would say historical background, biography of an author is not important or should not be seen in order to interpret a particular text. So therefore, from where do you derive this meaning? So meaning is drawn by unified textual elements. What are these unified textual elements that we get in the text? So you will have images, certain images that can point you to so many other things. You will have to understand the tone of the text. Then you have the symbols, and so therefore a reader will have to look at images, tone, symbols, such other things to interpret the text, and not look at the historical background and not look at what the author went through while he was writing the text. So, but what are the problems? There are a lot of problems with this particular school, because you can have only personal response. So your personal response, what you undergo or what the author has undergone, because I believe every text is nothing but the response of the experiences of the author to a particular event or a particular instance or a particular experience that he or she undergoes, and therefore that particular thing is actually removed or is not taken into consideration. For example, Charles Dickens, when he wrote his novels, I am sure he was heavily influenced by industrial revolution and the kind of criminal activities he saw because of the industrial revolution. So if in case we do not consider Charles Dickens's times while we interpret his novels, I think we are going to miss a very big part of it. So that is one problem. The second one is authorial intention. It's also important to know what the intentions of the author, because when a particular author writes something, I'm sure he will have his own intentions behind writing or producing a particular text or an art. So historical context and ideology, all these are something that are constructed, because history is important, and ideology, the writer's ideology, the artist's ideology is important, because depending on the kind of ideology that he or she follows, you'll have the corresponding text coming out from him. So, but the new critics would say, give importance to art and form alone and no other thing, and therefore do not fall back on any of the things that we spoke of, or otherwise we will look at. So just let me show you. So there we come with the end of introduction to literary theory, and this is one slide. It's just a quick look at the facts to know about Plato. So we are going to begin with the discussion of Plato, and he was born in approximately in 428 BCE, born in Greece, and all this small details, few details of his. So those are the few details, and then you have this his life, very short, brief instructions on his life. I'm sure many of you know he was a student of Socrates. Socrates is the first philosopher from Greece and is supposed to have been a great philosopher whose method of teaching people was just by dialogue, by going and speaking to people. So Plato was a student of Socrates and was a teacher of Aristotle, who is the next man we are going to study or look at. Now his writings, it's very interesting to see how the ancient Greeks or ancient Greek philosophers almost dealt with every topic on the earth, every topic, and therefore it's intriguing to see how they did not restrict themselves to a particular topic, unlike what we see today, because today our academics is strictly compartmentalized, because English teacher does not think it is important to know biology, and biology teacher does not think it's important for her to know something about commerce, and likewise. So, but whereas if you with regard to Plato and Aristotle and then a few other philosophers that follow, they sort of had knowledge of every subject, and that's why you see his writings explored justice, beauty, equality, and also contained discussions in aesthetics, political philosophy, theology, something to do with God, cosmology to do with universe, science, epistemology is a science of knowledge, and the philosophy of language, that's probably literature and language to do with all other languages as well. So it was not restricted to a particular field. He also founded something called academy, and that's supposed to be the first institution of higher learning. So, and basically he wanted to have philosopher kings, rulers, so who would be equipped with academics as well. So that's to do with the life of Plato and a few of his thoughts that we would be looking at. He was beginner of literary theory, and unfortunately his theory was not very systematic, but most of his ideas led Aristotle also to build up his own ideas. So one of the prominent ideas of Plato is mimesis. It's also called as representation or imitation. Now what exactly is mimesis? Now he says, now we here talk of poetry as mimesis, or poetry as an art which is mimetic. Now let me again add this disclaimer that when I speak of poetry, it does not necessarily mean poems as we think today, but it refers to all kinds of art that was written then. So, therefore, when he speaks of poetry, he does not refer to poems but even to plays that were produced during those times. So, he says poetry, when Plato talks of poetry, he says poetry is nothing but mimesis of nature, copy of the physical world. So, he is saying, so importantly, he makes a mutable, importantly, he makes a distinction between the ideal world and the physical world. So, therefore, all that you see around in the physical world is nothing but the copy of the real world, or the world of forms, or the world of ideas. Now, where did the world of ideas exist? It existed somewhere there above. I'm sure there would be a lot of Christian influence on this thought of Plato's, because something like Christians believe in heaven. Plato also thought the real world was somewhere there, the ideal world or the world of forms was somewhere there. So, all the things in the world were merely copies or the substandard things, or the second version of the originals. So, the originals remained as they were in the real world or the world of ideas, but the copies of all that were produced in the real world. So, therefore, the example could be, if you have a chair in front of you, or the chair that you are sitting on, that chair is not real, it's only a Xerox copy of the original, and the original chair exists only in the world of forms or in the world of ideas. So, therefore, the conclusion that could be drawn from this is that the chair that you are sitting on is inferior because it's not original but only a Xerox copy or the photocopy of the original. So, the best thing would only be there in the world of ideas and forms which are original. So, therefore, he says mutable copies of the timeless universals. So, timeless universals are there in the world of ideas and forms. Mutable copies are the ones that we see around in the world. They also get destroyed because they are just the Xerox copies. If they were original, they cannot be destroyed. And among the many things that are produced, poetry is one among them. So, poetry is a copy of the copy, and which leads us away from truth, and therefore it is misleading. So, poetry is not originally created by an artist or a poet, but so the original poetry exists in the world of forms or exists in the real world, and so what the poet produces is nothing but very inferior poetry or substandard poetry which does not tell us the truth. And because it does not tell us the truth, it misleads us or takes us away, far away from the truth. And therefore, I am sure by now you have understood that Plato would not support poets, because he says poets are the ones who would mislead people and take them astray from the truth. So, anyways, let's see the next thought that he speaks of. So, poetry, Plato was very, very ambiguous with what to do with the poets. And he says poets lie and ought to be banished from the ideal republic, or be heavily censored and kept in check. So, what lies do they tell us? Because they do not know the truth. Because the truth exists only in the ideal or the real world, and they just merely pretend to tell us the truth, and therefore they tell lies. And therefore he says they should be banished from the republic. He does not want to have any of the poets in his country. Now, this poet Plato and his ambiguity, we will come to that point in the next slide, because now when you see, he says poets ought to be banished, but whereas when he goes on to define them, he defines them with the divine words. All art and poetry, because they represent what is already an inferior representation, lead away from the truth. And this point, I think, is self-explanatory, because I have already spoken. You have a daffodil in the real world, and that daffodil is reproduced in the physical world. And so Wordsworth looks at the daffodil and then reproduces a poem. So therefore, if you can see, the first thing that exists is in the world of ideas or forms, and that the Xerox copy is that is reproduced in the form of a daffodil in the physical world, and on that a particular person is writing a poem. So therefore it is sort of 2-3 times removed from the reality, or 2-3 times taken away from the reality. And therefore he also says poetry is art is nothing but thrice removed from reality. So first time it is taken from the world of ideas or forms, and then it is brought to the physical world, and then from the physical world the poet takes the charge, and then he writes a poem on that, and then from the poet's mind comes the poem, and therefore it is thrice removed from reality. Inferior and deceptive mimesis, because it's only pretentious, or the poet only pretends to know the truth, but he does not know the truth. We'll also look at the thoughts of Plato on writing. Now there's this Plato's character Phaedrus, who is involved in important discussions on the evils of writing. Now there's another character in his book Republic named Socrates, who narrates the story of the invention of writing. Now this is the story, or this is how it goes about. Now you have this Egyptian god who is called Theoth, or also called Thoth, offers King Thamus this important gift of writing. Now this King Thamus, he rejects this gift that's given to him, and this is what he says: humans are better off without writing, because it substitutes an alien inscription. So therefore it's a dead thing, and therefore it would not exactly represent what otherwise a spoken language would represent, because it's a lifeless science for the living presence of spoken language. So it's lifeless. Written words are lifeless. You cannot see the emotions, the feelings, the expressions, the modulation, the tone in writing, whereas in speech all these things are possible. And so therefore in usual contexts, a king would actually be happy with his subjects if in case a particular gift is given, but whereas in this King Thamus is not happy, and therefore he rejects. So Plato falls on these lines, and he says therefore it's not just to write down your thoughts, and therefore it's also something that he says is very important there. Good memory is recollection of spiritual truths through wisdom, and that's something that he calls as philosophy. So what you are supposed to be doing is to recollect spiritual truths through wisdom, and that is something which is called philosophy. So more focus on spirituality, spiritual truths, and on wisdom, which is sort of different by other philosophers who are yet to come. So this is something that's very interesting of Plato, when he says, anyone who is seriously studying high matters will be the last to write about them, and thus expose his thought to the envy and criticism of men. Therefore, you should not write. So if you are going to write, and if you are seriously studying high matters, you would not write them, but rather keep it to yourself. So there could always be a debate whether this is right or wrong, but this is something important and interesting, I thought. Now what does he think of books? Very interesting takes on writing and books, because he says, being the most influential philosophers of his times, these are very interesting and controversial kind of things. He says books, they do not contain best thoughts. They are stored, they here referring to thoughts, they are stored with fairest of possessions, and if they are found, then it is because of gods have taken their wits away. So imagine you find a book and you begin to appreciate the book for having the best of thoughts. That means the writer's wits were taken away by God when he was actually writing that particular book. If not, a good writer will never ever share his thoughts in books and present himself to the envy and criticism of people. Now, what the final discussion in this part of the lecture would be to discuss the purpose of literature, and this is something that would come again and again with every person that would be discussing, and with every person the purpose of literature would change. So for Plato, it should serve moral and social functions, so bringing about good, or a didactic purpose, that's something that we call. So bringing about good in the society, to see that the morality of people is preserved, social functions to see that people follow particular rules and regulations, society is in order. This is the function of literature. And in his book Republic, he promotes respect for law, reason, there's this constant emphasis on the use of reason, and not emphasis on emotions, authority, self-discipline and piety. So therefore, respect for law, reason, authority, self-discipline and piety, which also shows he wouldn't be a radical in breaking rules and regulations. He would not be happy to see a society which is disorderly. He would want a society to be in order. He would want everybody to follow rules and regulations, and that sort of a person. And this should be done by literature. His character, Socrates, loves Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, one of the best books that was written. But he says, he calls for censorship on some pages, which would lead people astray, especially those pages which would sort of lead people astray or scandalize people, and such pages, he says, should be censored and should not be made available for public reading. And finally, literature should teach goodness and grace, and so therefore it would look like literature has the role of presenting world as the best place, or literature has the role of making world a best place. Probably, and in one word, all this purpose of literature could be defined as didactic purpose. Didactic is to teach good things, and probably that's the purpose of literature according to Plato. Very idealistic, but yet probably some people have done it, some have not done it, and there's a lot of debate that even today which takes place with regard to the purpose of literature. So those are few things that we have seen in this video. Thank you so much for listening, and see you all in the next class.